You're listening to the Technology for Mindfulness podcast, episode 32, hosted by me, Robert Plotkin. Today I'm going to be speaking with Ted Meissner, the manager of online programming and community development at the Center for Mindfulness in Medicine, Healthcare, and Society, where he also teaches mindfulness-based stress reduction, also known as MBSR. Ted is also the host of the podcast Present Moment, Mindfulness Practice and Science. He's been meditating since the early 1990s and is the executive director of the Secular Buddhist Association and is active in the mindfulness community in many other ways. We're extremely pleased to welcome Ted Meissner to the Technology for Mindfulness podcast. In the upcoming interview with Ted Meissner, we'll talk about many of the opportunities and challenges that technology poses for mindfulness education, both in person and online. For today's tip, I'd like to address a challenge that many of us have, which is not necessarily caused by technology, but can be exacerbated by it, which is finding the time to engage in mindfulness practice, particularly meditation, every day. So what I'd like to suggest is to set a ridiculously small goal of meditating for 1 minute a day. Now, you might think that's absurd, that there's no benefit to meditating for just 1 minute a day. Why would you do that? Let me give you at least two benefits that I've found. One is that by setting such a small goal, I've found I am much more likely to actually satisfy it. I can always find a minute a day to meditate. And what that means is I actually end up meditating every day and obtain the direct benefit of engaging in that practice, even if it's only for a minute. But at least for me, I gain an additional kind of a meta benefit of feeling good about the fact that I have followed through on this goal or intention of meditating. And that I found helps me to stick with it every day. Whereas if I had set the goal of 30 minutes of meditating and I then missed a day and another day, I know, and I know this from experience, would most likely end up feeling reduced motivation over time and I would let the habit slip. But there's a sneaky side benefit I've found in my own experience to setting a goal of a minute a day, which is that in practice, when I sit down to do that minute, many times I actually end up meditating for longer. That I actually have the time and the ability and the interest to meditate for much longer than the minute. And I've only found that that's true by sitting down to start with the intention of meditating for just a minute. And I know that if alternatively I had set the goal of meditating for 30 minutes, many times I probably would have not sat down at all. But I now know I often have much more than the minute, and I know that because I actually sit down every day with the goal of meditating for a minute. I am essentially tricking myself to sit down and get started, which is the hardest part. Hope you find that helpful, and I hope you enjoy the upcoming interview with Ted Meissner. Hi, Ted, and welcome to the Technology for Mindfulness podcast.
Hi, Robert. Thank you so much for having me here. I'm very excited to be on the podcast.
Oh, you're welcome. It's great to have you. And in thinking about you and your work in preparation for the interview, what really came to mind is that I see you as sitting on that edge between tradition and innovation. I don't know if that rings true with you at all.
that sharp and pointed seat, yes. Yes, it does.
Maybe it feels like a hot seat sometimes.
Just a bit, yes.
So maybe you can talk a little bit about what that experience is like to, if this is a fair way of put it, trying to remain true to the traditions of mindfulness as a practice and a way of teaching and being while bringing modern technology to it.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's really an interesting intersection as you explore in this podcast and technology for mindfulness is that like so many things that are taught traditionally in an in-person kind of context, anyone listening to the podcast think about just going to school and taking a class. For most of us, that was done with a teacher sitting at the head of a room and a bunch of other students. Mindfulness, as you know, is a little bit different in that often just the physical structure of an in-person classroom is different. We're often in a circle, and there's a bit less of the didactic and much more of the sharing and exploring of one another's experience with mindfulness and the practice and learning about that and stress reactivity and all that good stuff. And now we have this thing called the internet that neither you nor I grew up with. It's something that came along much later. In fact, computers were first hitting the scene in a more manageable way for the average user when I was in high school. And so how we see it today is that now there's been this tremendous opening of ways in which people might engage with a contemplative practice using technology. And of course, that comes with its own set of challenges. There are risks of the technology being the focus rather than the mindfulness practice. But it also opens up a world that otherwise people might not have access to. So, for example, 100 years ago, if you wanted to learn about meditation, if you were very fortunate, there was someone nearby, physically, geographically nearby. And you'd have to go to that place. And if someone, that teacher, for example, gave a talk, typically it wasn't recorded. And so it was just a one-time thing. And you were with a group of people that might not quite be like you are. There might be a great variety of ideological views and practice experiences and things like that. And if you shift forward to today, it's a bit different. You can go online as far away as your laptop or your iPad or your cell phone even, and join a group of people that you see face to face, and you're all there with very specific and coordinated intent around a program that you may be taking. And it's recorded so that you have the capability of listening to it later. And with various and sundry apps, you have the ability to listen to experts from all over the world, not only in a variety of contemplative practices and traditional backgrounds, but also different languages. And they're doing guidance for different levels of experience. So if you're a beginner, you can be with beginners. And if you have a bit more experience, you can be with others who are equitable in that. So to me, this is really opening up opportunity for those who may be either geographically limited, there's nobody nearby physically, they're ideologically limited. The local center might not quite be the setting that is a good match for who you are. Or perhaps physically, those who have some physical impairments and can't really leave the house may also still have access to what everyone else does. So like you, I see this as a tremendous opportunity that, of course, comes with risks that are not unique to mindfulness. They're there in anything that might be having its intersection and its time with technology.
Yeah, you came back a few times to opportunity and access, and how much that's changed over the last 100 years, and certainly even in the last 5 or 10 years. And I think it seems like you touched also on flexibility, or indirectly what you might call personalization, the ability of people to find teachings that suit where they are at the moment and who they are. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. So, for example, if you use any one of a number of apps that you and I would be very familiar with, let's say you're interested in just an awareness of breath meditation, just something to help with exercising your attentional capacity. You can find guided meditations that maybe you only have 5 minutes, and that's all the time that you have available to truly dedicate to practice right now. It may be that you want to sit for an hour and have more silence and a bit less guidance. That may be different than someone else who 20 minutes and, I'm new at this stuff, so I'd like a lot of guidance in the beginning. Mm-hmm. Compare all of those differences to someone who may be looking for a loving kindness meditation, or mountain meditation, or some guidance on mindful movement. So you can find all of that there of different lengths, different amounts of guidance, very closely guided, or maybe with no guidance whatsoever, and you're just looking for a timer with some nice bells. All of that is available to you.
Yeah, it's really incredible. I've personally experienced it. Sometimes I'm looking for something to help me sleep or deal with stress, or like you said, just the ability to pick the amount of time seems like such a radical change.
Right, from going to a center where the talks are half an hour long, the meditation is half an hour long, or if you go, it's, you have 40 minutes and then 10 minutes of walking and then 40 more minutes of sitting. That might not fit so well with what everyone's lived reality is. For some folks, that's just not as approachable. And especially if you got to physically get there, that can be very difficult for, say, a single parent or someone who works second shift, and that's the only time that's available. This really, really opens that up for them.
Yeah, it might mean the difference between doing that 5 minutes online and doing nothing.
Right. Exactly.
Wonder if we can talk a little bit about the challenges or risks of this. Another thing I've experienced is one flip side of the incredible amount of choice. Sometimes is a feeling of being overwhelmed by the choice.
I have good news. There's an incredible amount of choice. I have bad news. There's an incredible amount of choice.
One of my favorite books of the last couple of decades was The Paradox of Choice, which talks about this phenomenon exactly, that the freedom can be a burden when you have too many options at your disposal. So wonder if you could talk a little bit about that, and perhaps how any of the work that you are doing to bring mindfulness education online addresses this abundance of choice.
Oh, that's a great question. So along with anything that becomes very popular and very well known, is that the general public won't necessarily have an idea or a way to distinguish between a teacher who is really, really skilled and very competent. They've done their work, and they're really good at this, and they've been able to maximize the innate talents that they have with really good teaching, and the integrity of what they're doing in their programs is really top notch. It's very hard for someone who may be a novice, or even someone with a lot of experience sometimes, to distinguish between that person, who's someone you might want to get some long-term guidance in as a teacher, and someone who's, they did a half-day weekend program, and now they've hung out their shingle as, I'm a mindfulness teacher. And they may be an innately talented, really, really skilled person who, nonetheless, through an innocent lack of understanding, may be giving some guidance that could be harmful, or the understanding that mindfulness and contemplative practice is not, it's not a panacea, it's not magic, and it doesn't cure everything. In fact, in some instances, it can be very harmful for people to engage in say an 8-week kind of mindfulness program. And so that's one risk, is that there's so much you're not really sure what's out there that's credible and has the appropriate boundaries in place for the safety and the well-being of people who are participating in programs like this. Fortunately, what I've seen is a great deal of attention lately, thanks to the work, for example, the work of Willoughby Britton at Brown, doing just such outstanding work on this particular difficulty, or David Treleaven and his trauma-sensitive mindfulness work and book, which I highly recommend to people, that talks about why, although it may seem strange for those who are very familiar with mindfulness, and it's been wonderful for them to hear that maybe it can be harmful for some people. And that kind of goes against the grain of, but how is just attending to breathing, for example, harmful? Right. And of course, there's a whole reasoning behind that. And that's one of the things that education programs like the one I'm involved with at UMass, at the Center for Mindfulness, John Kabat-Zinn started the mindfulness-based stress reduction program about 38 years ago. We've really tried to pay attention to that, and even updating our own information about what are the best ways to ensure participant well-being. And so when someone is looking for a teacher or program, what I would recommend in finding one that has teachers who've been through this kind of educational program that's not, just a short weekend program and there you are, you're a teacher. Take a look, check out the website if they're affiliated with some of the universities that are known for this. I know Lesley University, for example, has a master's program. Of course, my own UMass Medical Center at the Center for Mindfulness, UCSD, UCLA, their MARC program, of course, Exeter and Oxford and Bangor all have programs where they really tend to what that last group formulated as the mindfulness-based intervention teacher assessment criteria, by which these 6 domains of competence for mindfulness teachers are very clearly articulated and very beautifully articulated and very consistently rated in tests where they'll do a study and see, okay, if person X, Y, and Z are graded by different people using this MBI TAC, as it's called, and the amazing consistency that comes in those results. So checking things out, finding out where the person got their credentials can be very helpful in ascertaining, is this someone who, I know yoga experiences this as well. People have been training for years and have a really very strong training and personal practice themselves, are in competition with those who are not. And through, again, often quite innocently, doing things that may not be quite as beneficial and sometimes could be even a little risky for participants in their programs as well.
Yeah, I mean, some of what you're talking about seems to raise another razor's edge, which is between perhaps let's call it mass distribution of content, pre-recorded guided meditations, which are just what they are, versus something that's personalized or interactive, where there's a skilled, trained teacher who is able to pay attention to the student during their practice, perhaps pick up on ways in which they might be experiencing some harm or stress. I think one of the things you might be alluding to is, there are people with a trauma history for whom deep breathing may or may not be helpful, may be quite harmful. And if they're listening to a pre-recorded breath attention meditation and there's no teacher there to attend to them, right, there may be there could be a risk there. Right. So this edge between teacher guidance, whether in person or remotely, is another question. But teacher guidance and interaction versus someone receiving, let's call it mass or one-size-fits-all kind of meditation. Can you talk a little bit about that and how in your work you try to address this tension?
Yeah, absolutely. So, one thing that I've done in my own guidance recordings is in the beginning, there is what is sometimes viewed as a bit of a lengthy introduction. And the reason behind that is it talks about self care and finding what I was so delighted to see David Treleaven's book, him using the term home base for attention. And so having a guided recording that has an introduction, particularly if it's a longer meditation, say like a 45-minute body scan, if there's at least a few minutes of that in the beginning that has some guidelines around if you begin to notice some difficulties, some perhaps surprising or painful things are coming up, either physically or emotionally, here are a few things that you can do. And shifting attention, stopping the meditation entirely, doing something else, putting attention in another place until you get a little stability. And once that's set a little bit, tentatively exploring, continuing with the guidance and constantly checking in with yourself and seeing in a light way, how am I doing? So having that in the recording, particularly for longer recordings and rather than a 5-minute meditation, which might, I would expect in many cases, be short enough that it can't really get deep enough to result in difficulty. But for some people it will, particularly if it's the first time they're trying. Other things that I would encourage people looking for as they do some checking in this is, as you look at the online materials for online programs, for example, uh, is there text about this window of comfort and what to look for? Is there some guidance above and beyond what's in the recording? Is there also some printed material with it? And for the live classes themselves, as you know, I sent you a paper that I wrote on mindfulness programs, that there's a really quite a wide variety of what we mean by online programs. And that can range from a teacher sends you an email once a week, and that's it for you. An interaction with a teacher is you get some links to some stuff, you get a little information, but there isn't anything beyond maybe asynchronous typed text between you and a teacher and maybe no one else in the class. And let's call that one of the most basic kinds of online program, to something a little more robust, where you might have some direct time with a teacher, at least audio, and then what I would call, at least at the present time, more of a Cadillac program where you have not only real-time, regularly scheduled and long, so several hours of audio with a teacher and other participants, but it's also video. And for me, this is one of the very strong defining characteristics of a really robust online mindfulness program, is that seeing the teacher and the teacher being able to see the students and see how they're doing. Although it may seem to those who only teach in person that that's extremely limited, what I have found in several years now of teaching mindfulness programs online at United Healthcare and the Center for Mindfulness and on my own, is that actually that window kind of disappears, and you have pretty deep connections with other participants, with the teacher, and the teachers with students. And the video part is very important, and it's extremely important because we are such visual creatures. So much of our communication is not done so much by the words, which may be one thing, but the body language, the expression, the tone is very different. So seeing someone is important. It also allows for an in vivo sharing and inquiry with the participant. So there's a back and forth, and there's this richness of the experience. Even if you're observing an interaction, it may also touch something in you as another participant. So there are lots of different layers of this and lots of different levels of maturity in the capability model of online programs as well.
Yeah, it's very interesting. This last part you talked about courses that have an online interactive video component between and among the teacher and multiple students, because as incredible as the variety of pre-recorded guided meditations are online, once you're listening to one, I often think it's not the experience itself isn't much different than what you would have gotten from listening to it on audio cassette back in the 70s.
Mm-hmm.
It's a pre-recorded guided meditation. There is no interaction. It's one-to-one, and one of the ones is not there. Is pre-recorded.
Right.
And so now you're talking about a live class with a teacher, multiple students, all of whom can see each other and hear each other in real time. This must be, I assume, pretty recent. And maybe you can talk a little bit, we've been talking mostly about what the experience is like for the students. Maybe you could talk a little bit about that. But we could also shift to what is this like for the teachers to shift from their traditional method of teaching in person to teaching like this online.
Yeah, that's a great question. So just in my own experience, starting with Adobe Connect, 5 or 6 years ago, and my colleague Mark Nickelbein starting our practice circle through presentmomentmindfulness.com, and having that use video. So you'd see everyone in a grid, Brady Bunch or Hollywood Squares style, dating ourselves a little bit here, and that made a big difference. And one of the really big advantages and why we selected Adobe Connect at the time, now several years ago, is that also allowed us to do virtual rooms. So let's say you had a Brady Bunch sized group of people. You had 9 faces on screen. One's the teacher, and everyone else is a participant. You, as the teacher, can now put people into little partner virtual rooms so that the screen changes and then it's just one person and another person. A much more intimate conversation can occur there. And so when you bring people back to the main room after a few minutes of whatever the topic is that they were talking about together, it's really interesting that the energy is very different. People seem a bit more lively, in most cases a bit more light. I usually hear laughter coming in as people are brought back into the main room with everyone else. And it's a very different experience as a teacher when you're doing inquiry. It's like, okay, so let's talk. What has been happening with your practice this week? What have you run into? What was surprising? In a way, the dyads in MBSR for an in-person class, this replicates that. It greases the skids a little bit in getting those who might not be as comfortable talking to enable them to speak up, because they've been speaking in a relatively safe environment with another person. And I would suggest even an extremely safe environment is typically their own home. Not always, but typically. And that's where most people are usually calling in from, is their home. And everyone there is not experiencing the after effects of traffic or the first day of class syndrome and not knowing anybody and all of that. So in some ways, I find that to be extremely beneficial and very helpful. But there are also some difficulties too. As we shifted over to another tool, which was even more effective and better at managing bandwidth issues, for example. What we found is, as I worked with other teachers, is that a comfort with working with the technology was very important. And I've seen circumstances where teachers have had difficulties with the technology, and it showed, because they're also seen, they're also on screen, and that tension can really strongly influence, and perhaps not a way we'd always want to, for a class. Their own tension is activating for all the participants. So very important for a teacher to be just seamlessly comfortable with the technology in using it. And it doesn't mean that problems don't happen now and then. Of course they do. And that itself is an opportunity to practice in the same way that one might have a flat tire or run into traffic when going to an in-person class. So for teaching, and Robert, as you know, I do both in-person and online live. I don't really find a great deal of difference in the effects of what participants get out of the class between the two. There's certainly different environments. And for those who may be very uncomfortable with digital technology, it may be more appropriate to take an in-person class because traffic and driving and all that is less stressful than just opening a computer. I totally understand that. And that's, again, it's simply another means for people to find the teaching and have access to it. So that comfort level is very important. You and I have been working with computers and technology for a long time. So for us, this is pretty secondhand. It's pretty second nature. We know how to do this. We're very comfortable with it. If things come up, we know how to deal with them in a very reflexive and mindful way while still honoring the experience of the participant in the class and ourselves. Where it can be a bit challenging is for those participants who didn't grow up with technology. That can be challenging, but I'm finding that, even younger participants in classes, for them, this way of doing teaching it's also second nature. This is part of the culture that they were raised in. So they don't have, for most, of course, there are some exceptions to this, but they seem to really take to this very well. So it's not a question anymore about it. And I think about when cars were new, driving that might have been very, very challenging for some who were used to riding a horse or walking. Driving a car was just way too much. But for those who grew up driving cars, do you really think very carefully and strongly about every turn signal that you put on, or turn of the steering wheel, or gently applying the brakes or gas? It's you already have the reflexes in there. And so it's very similar with technology.
Yeah, and it sounds like the experiences that you're helping to enable are ones in which you're facilitating people connecting with each other. That seems to be
Right.
a theme coming through here, that you're not turning over responsibility to the technology and however it happens to work. I know you put a lot of thought into what the experience is of, I was about to say users as a default.
We can call it user experience. That's an accepted term.
But maybe you can talk a little bit more about other ways in which you've given thought to that and implemented it. We talked a little bit offline about things like the app component. I mean, I've had the experience in various courses, not necessarily mindfulness courses, where there's some part that's in person where you take the class, and then there's some other part that's online, and the teacher might give a handout with a link to a file or a video and send an email. And I've often found that as a student, the experience feels like the in-person classes are something that's totally distinct from the part that's online, and they're not really integrated. And if I lose that sheet of paper or that email, I'm lost because it had some critical information in it. And, the whole experience of on and offline aren't really integrated with each other. And even for someone like me who is savvy, I've often found the amount of effort I have to put in, again, to find that email the teacher sent before the course started is too much, or it adds to my frustration instead of doing what I think it's intended to do, which is to make things easier.
Right. Oh, this is such a wonderful question. And uh, as you know, a lot of my background is I'm a corporate guy, a business guy from IT in very large companies. And a lot of that had to do with user experience because I was the IT guy who would ask, but what does this mean to the user? Instead of, ooh, what's the code for that?
Right.
It's a little bit different. And that continues because you can have a really outstanding app that does this great magical thing, but if the person who needs it can't get to it,
Yeah.
or has a bad experience in getting to it, and it's just so frustrating for them, they're not going to use it, you've lost.
Right.
And it doesn't work. And really, especially for something as refined an experience and often as challenging an experience as mindfulness can be, you really need to do your best to mitigate that kind of thing. So you mentioned a very common experience of, can't find that email and class is starting in 5 minutes kind of thing. So one of the things that I've been doing in my own work and then also at the Center for Mindfulness is having this awareness in how are people using the technology they have? What is it they're using? And so as you think about for example, a live online class, it's important to be able to see the rest of the class. And so the encouragement is for people to use a computer with a full-sized screen to see everybody in the Brady Bunch and be able to distinguish between, Mr. Brady and Marcia, so you can tell who's who. And yet, we also know from metrics in the IT world that most people are now, for example, getting their email exclusively from their mobile device, their cell phone.
Right.
So, and that's not just for email, it's also for other things like social networking and stuff like that. So the expectation was, and we did some, these are not studies, you're just kind of asking people, what is it that you use during the week? If you had some options about doing the home practice, guided meditation recordings. And what I heard very consistently is over 90% in my own classes online when I asked that, what are you using for the home assignments during the week? The device was my mobile device, my cell phone.
Right.
Whether it was an iPhone or Droid, whichever. And so the challenge was, and I think I met this in my own designs at presentmomentmindfulness.com, and then at the Center for Mindfulness, we're using the same interface now that I built there, that has all of it in one place. And it looks just fine and works the same way, whether you're on a computer or if you're looking at it through your cell phone and your mobile device. In fact, I say it looks a little bit better on your cell phone because I know it's much easier for someone to plug in the earbuds to their cell phone and listen to the guided meditation, especially when compared to, well, the family computer's in the living room or it's in the office and there's not really a place for me to do the lying down mindful movement, but it's much easier for people to do this with their cell phone. So the design includes access to the class. So there's no last minute, oh my gosh, I need the email. It's in the app. Everything you need is right there. There's no last minute, oh, what do I need to do this week? It's right on week 3 or week 4 or week 5, whichever week you're in. Oh, I need to get hold of my teacher because I got to let them know I'm going to be a little bit like, oh, my teacher's email is right there. And I just tap that and it opens an email on my phone, which is what I use for email anyway, if I'm like most people. So really what we've tried to do is just on that basic level of putting everything in one place. So anything you need for the class is there. And you may click on something that opens a new window, granted, but it's still all within one spot. And then making that as simple and intuitive as possible so that the choices are things like join the live class when it's time to join the live class each week. That's exactly what it's called. Or If you want an overview of the class, that's one of the first thing that's on the page about it, and that has all the dates and logistic information. So having it be something that is really very intuitive and simple, and not so busy and has so many choices that you can't find what you need to find. There are only a few choices on there because there only need to be a few choices on there.
Yeah, I really like what you said about we don't want the technology to make things harder. Of course, it'd be great if it'd make things easier. And when you mentioned, the schedule being on there, how many times have I attended a class or known of a yoga or karate class nearby, and because of weather or the teacher's schedule or a holiday, the regular schedule isn't being followed. And
Right.
how hard can it be to find that fact out?
Right. We were just talking today in a meeting at the Center for Mindfulness about if we also used the web app that I built for our in-person classes, how much easier it would be to have right on the web app, if they're due to weather or some conditions, have something pop up letting people know that class is canceled tonight.
Right.
See you next week. That's something we really should be able to do and enable pretty easily, instead of, oh, let's see, I gotta find a computer and log on to this website and check this hidden thing, and then shows the schedule. Instead of just, look at my phone,
Right.
and it tells me. And that's I think an appropriate use of technology as a tool, because that's just helping you rather than consuming your attention, as so much digital media is today.
Yeah. And just to step back, I know you keep referring to the Center for Mindfulness, and I'm sure people make the connection. But for those who haven't, we're talking about the Center for Mindfulness, which teaches and is probably most well known for mindfulness-based stress reduction, MBSR. I know, among other things, but I don't know, and perhaps you do know the numbers of how many thousands of people over the years have gone through at least the basic MBSR course in person.
Yeah, so that's again another great question. We have had over, I think the current count is, I think it's 26,000 people. I don't recall off the top of my head. I'll need to look at the numbers for you and get the updated information about those who've gone through our teacher training, teacher education program, and our MBSR teachers. And those we've trained ourselves over the course of the past 38 years. So it's difficult for us to get an idea of what the worldwide numbers are, because we don't track, of the thousands of people that have been through our teacher education program, all of their courses. Of our certified teachers, it may be hundreds of courses just in the past handful of years, let alone the past nearly 40.
Right.
So worldwide numbers are really tough. And for those who are interested in finding an in-person class, if that's very important to you, and that's fine, just doing a Google search of your nearest city and the word and MBSR should bring some hits, because it really is taught all over the world. And if you don't find anything close and convenient, I might know a place that does it online.
Well, that's where I was going, both for people who, let's say, have gone through the basic MBSR course, did it in person, and perhaps were under the impression, quite reasonably, that was the only way it was still being done. I wanted people to know that's no longer true. And there may very well be people who have wanted to take MBSR and couldn't, or found it too difficult logistically for their schedules or for travel reasons. And I wanted them to know that all of the things you're talking about are, I believe, are these all live now? Or are some of the features you talked about in development for MBSR?
So everything I've mentioned, except what just came up today, I haven't built that tonight. The mention of closed classes for in-person. We do have that. So We're just looking at our fall schedule as of this recording for 2018, our fall programs. We'll have, I believe, an even split of in-person and live online. So both options are available to you. One of the things that I really find wonderful about the online, and of course, Robert, you and I share this, so consider the source. This is something I'm very keen on. One of the really outstanding things to me as a teacher, and certainly to participants as well, they've expressed this, is in just one of my recent classes teaching MBSR, I had 9 different countries and over a dozen different states in just the US represented. And that was amazing because we had a world of time zones, which presents its own interesting nuances. And of course, there's extra information we have about time zones, but really everything I've mentioned, taking the full live MBSR course is something that we do online now. And you can take that from the convenience of your home or wherever you happen to be. So even traveling, for those who sometimes have vacation or something comes up, a family emergency, and they're traveling, but they really still want to be there for class, they can. And again, it's not recommended as ideal, but in a situation that's just uncommon. I'm traveling right now. I'm on vacation, so I'm going to use my cell phone to join the live class. There's still video. There's still audio, and that's really amazing. It enables people to do the full program where they might have missed a class or two, which is again a wonderful advantage of being able to do this through digital technology and what that offers. But yes, essentially the entire class and everything that is part of a live MBSR class is also available online.
Well, I just wanted to make sure that people were aware of that as an option. Of course, the live in-person class is still very much alive and available to people. I wonder if we could take a minute to look to the future. I'm going to ask you to engage in what might be a little bit of speculation, but you've pushed the envelope towards live online audio and video interactive classes. What is in the works? What would be the next stage? Is it virtual reality, holograms, or
you laugh? You say that.
Well, I laugh, and I'm being serious. And are there any? Do you foresee? I know there's always, of course, unforeseen challenges, but are there either limits that you would see to the usefulness of the technology in terms of changing how a mindfulness education is delivered, or just challenges in implementing it?
Yeah. So one of the things that we are living in the aspirations of just 2 years ago at the Center for Mindfulness, the tools that we use at UMass, the medical schools, didn't incorporate live video.
Right.
And so just being able to do that, as our partners in IT that work with us on this said, yeah, this is 5 years ahead of what anyone else is doing here within our environment, within our schools. So we're already living that, which is great. And we've made significant improvements just with this last 2 cycles, starting with the work that I did on Present Moment in design and making this an app and making that more useful that way, an HTML5 app, a web app. For what's coming for the future, as I think about things like, for example, virtual reality. Virtual reality technology is progressing tremendously. I'd say there's some sensibility and reflection about, so if you put on a headset and you're on a beach and it's a guided meditation on a beach, but really you're not on a beach, you're somewhere else. Is that being mindful? Because you're
Sure.
not in that environment. So one of my, a few different thoughts on that. And this is a conversation I had through email with a friend who is very much an in-person teacher, and they're very concerned about online stuff. And they said, but online there's no environment. They can't connect with the senses. And I said, well, that's not true. They're still in an environment. There's still sounds around them. You're still seeing. You're still feeling. There's still a sense of smell and taste and touch. All of the environment is there. That you're seeing others on a window rather than in 3 dimensions is just a different dynamic of that particular kind of engagement. So I'm for a program, for a mindfulness program, I'm a little bit less disposed towards virtual reality, with a couple of caveats that I think will be coming soon. And I'll say that now. If anyone comes out with that, you heard it here first. Is virtual reality going someplace else other than where you are? I don't think is inherently wrong or bad or to be judged as not mindful, for the simple reason that for some people, for example, someone who is in hospice, this may be the only way in which they can engage with the world. This is as close as it may be to someone who can't move, and so just taking the perspective that individual experiences are extremely diverse and unique to that person. So it may be a tremendous boon to those who have other issues than what we might normally be experiencing in our lives. Might be a wonderful opening to practice for others. So what I expect we'll see soon, and this is something I've brought up actually a couple of years ago and I want to see happen again, so you heard it here first, everyone, on Robert's podcast, is, let's say you have a virtual headset and there's a planned live broadcast. Maybe it's a recording. I imagine this would start as a recording where you put on the headset and it's other people sitting with you on that beach. And there's a guided meditation, or maybe it's just a bell rings and before you turn this on, you set the time. Maybe it's 20 minutes and you're there, and the technology is such that it's on a loop. And when it gets to the 20 minutes, it closes the loop and the bell rings, and that then shifts to the clip of everyone getting up and bowing and smiling and laughing. So I imagine we're going to see that before we see what I would expect as the next level, which is the VR headsets will get smaller. They'll probably be a bit more like glasses by this point. And you put on your VR glasses and your earbuds, or probably something even less unsightly than that by this point. And you'll have the experience of being in an in-person class virtually. It will be a coming together of these 2 different aspects of live online and in person, in that you'll put on the glasses and you'll be in the meditation hall at the Center for Mindfulness, and everyone else will be in the meditation hall at the Center for Mindfulness, even though they're in their own homes. And you'll either see them as, I imagine at first, avatars, but perhaps eventually those avatars will be very close replications of you, that there'll be a scan and then you're in. And so people see you as you, and you do the guidance. And as you look across the circle of practitioners, you'll see the other people and they'll be seeing you too, even though you're at home. I think that will come, and it's probably going to be a while. We'll have recorded things first, but eventually I would like to see that, because it takes a really big next step in how people connect. And as you said earlier, very insightfully, you're so correct. So much of this is about connection. So much of this is about just that human interaction. And at the end of a class, when people are like, well, what next? I'm going to miss you guys and all of that. There may be ways to much more easily facilitate people getting together, even if they're in wildly different time zones. So that's why I'm very eager to see what comes next in technology and don't see it as something bad. And of course, like with anything else, people who engage with technology need to just check in, see if this is doing what is helpful to you. Is it taking over, or is it really facilitating your practice, or is it distraction? And sometimes distraction is the right thing. That is what's needed.
Well, that's a great topic for another conversation about when can distraction facilitate mindfulness.
Yeah.
But I really appreciate you taking us out to that, I don't want to say end point, but something that might feel very far away and that might strike people initially as being counter to mindfulness, but making the case that if it's done with the intention of facilitating connection amongst people, rather than just using the technology for its own sake, regardless of its impact on people, could actually be a tool that facilitates mindfulness. It could be a technology for mindfulness.
Right. I agree. And there are those who are dear to me, loved ones that I have only seen on a screen. And so the level of connection that one can have is maybe a bit more than people might suspect, and still be every bit as true as those in-person connections we're very blessed to be able to make when we can.
That's really great. Well, thanks so much, Ted. I've really enjoyed speaking with you, learning about how you are pushing forward that cutting edge of bringing modern technology to the teaching of mindfulness, to spread it to more people in more places, make it more widely available to people, while really staying true to the tradition of mindfulness teaching.
Thank you so much, Robert. It's been a great honor to be on Tech for Mindfulness. Really appreciate the work you do, because as you know, it can sometimes be an uphill battle about technology and mindfulness.
Well, thanks so much for being here, Ted. Thanks for joining us for this Technology for Mindfulness podcast with me, Robert Plotkin, and today's guest, Ted Meissner, the manager of online programming and community development at the Center for Mindfulness and the host of the podcast Present Moment, Mindfulness Practice and Science. You can find out more about Ted at presentmomentmindfulness.com and at the Center for Mindfulness website at umassmed.edu/CFM. If you liked today's episode, please leave us a review on iTunes and share the episode with your friends. Those and all other links are in the show notes, and check out our blog at technologyformindfulness.com for information and tips about science, technology, and mindfulness. I'm Robert Plotkin, and I'll join you next time on the Technology for Mindfulness podcast.